Hey everybody, Ragnarok back with the 7th game from the World Open. In this game I played the Sicilian Dragon and I was playing as black. My opponent was about 1775 or so, and I did end up winning this game. So e4, c5, knight f3, d6 normally just to block the e5 pawn push, d4 opening up the Sicilian, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight to f6, knight to c3, defending this pawn on e4. Everything's all pretty much the same as the previous games I've played the dragon. Now's where you play g3, g6, sorry. Bishop to e3, and then bishop g7, completing the dragon and the Yugoslav attack. So again, he's going to want to get f3, queen to d2, and then ultimately bring his bishop over to g6. So f3, preventing the knight from coming in and breaking up that, that bishop-queen duo there. Castling. Bishop to c4, knight to d7. Really better probably is knight to c6, just attacking the knight. I guess I was scared of him taking and me taking back with my pawn, but realistically that's not that bad of a structure. So I bring my knight here to d7. Now this is where I had to think for a little bit because I was a little confused by this move. Eventually my knight is going to go to e5, attacking the bishop, eventually forking both the queen and the bishop when they're here. Everything happens the same. I do bring my knight up and he brings his queen up, so it's as if the same thing happened, except his bishop's not here, and then it would slide back on his turn now instead. So the same thing. I guess he didn't have to do the queen move, but that's really where he wants to go anyway, so nothing really different, just a different order of moves, and not entirely forced to go back into this variation. But we did. So bishop to d7, preparing to bring my rook over to c8, so I can bring my knight on c4, attacking both of these as I mentioned. Now, however, it's not as effective because this knight attacking the queen and the bishop forces this bishop to take. Now if I do it, his queen can probably move up here or at the worst back here. But he brings his bishop into here, and now I think this is actually a mistake. So I bring my rook over to c8. What he could do now is push h4 and then just start to take in here. If I ever take this bishop, his queen takes, his pawn on h5 will eventually come off the file, and I've got a very weak h7 pawn. So that probably would have been a good answer for him, but instead he takes my bishop, and I take back. So yes, he's gained my bishop. These squares are now very weak around my king, and he can start pushing in the h4 and g4 pawns like the Yugoslav usually wants to do. The only difference is his queen is not here, but I think he traded a little bit too soon for that. So he castles like normal. I bring my bishop in, or my knight in, and now again it's not the same forced where he has to take, but in this case he does. Now I thought maybe he would do something like this. I'm not sure the best answer I would follow up with this. Maybe bringing, let's see. If he went there, I might bring my knight over here, just trying to force away this bishop for good. So I might get it anyway, and then he would either double these pawns on the b file or bring his knight back, and his knight's in a good spot in the center here. So maybe he didn't want to do that. I think if he does this kind of the same thing, there's no real time for him to move a bishop because he probably would do that. And then meanwhile I'm going to start my c-file attack with my queen here, eventually maybe my other rook up here and my other rook sliding over. So he does take, again I don't know if it was forced, but it allows me to take my rook off to c4. Now without my bishop here attacking this square, I don't have any discover attacks where I would, if I had my bishop here, this knight could take this pawn, knight takes, and then rook takes with an attack on the queen, but that is completely missing in this particular game. Then he plays g4, and I bring my queen out. Now the main reason I do this is because I want to distract these knights. The only way for him to really attack this queen, because I am threatening if he does something else, I can take here, and if he takes back, I can take back with this pawn, and his king is very stuck over here. Some sort of rook lift maneuver would be coming, and I think that's tough to stop with these pawns here. Best is probably just to like bring his queen away and give himself an attack square. Meanwhile, I still have my rook over here to try to take this pawn here. So that would be bad for him. So it's kind of almost forced for him to come back here. I'm not really sure any other answers he could have. with this queen here, he can't do things like push this pawn. Not only does this break this structure up, but it does end up dropping a knight as well. So he's kind of limited there, and he's almost forced to do this this knight move here. So I bring my queen back. Mission accomplished. I got his knights out of the center, but something I missed was the move g5. Now his knight can come here with tempo on my queen, forcing it back to the d8 square. Now, ideally, I'd like to have enough time to get my my f-rook over behind my queen, because 3 pieces on this knight, if this knight ever moves, I'm going to win the queen. So what I would do next is start pushing, if I got this rook over here, start pushing b5 and then b4. If he pushed a3, I would just push a5 or something like that, so that I can get this pawn pushed through. His pawns are a little bit blocking his rooks from being able to come over here. So that would be the plan. However, because he does this pawn push, I have to move my knight away, and that allows his knight to come into the central square, which I didn't want. So overlook that move. However, I have removed his knight from this square, so if I can ever get my rook over here, I could potentially win a queen with that trade there. And in this scenario, it would be checkmate too, with the queen c2 follow-up. So because of that, I have to go here to protect this pawn. There's no real good alternative giving up that pawn. That weakens this square, just really bad. So I have to go back to d8. He pushes h4, and I thought this was a little bit too slow, I guess. The only good thing about that is it allows his rook to come up to defend the c2 square, but he can't really break through this. If he could, he would push h5, get his pawn off this file, slide his queen over, and then have an attack on h2, now that this pawn is blocking my knight from coming back to f6. But that whole plan seems a little slow, because I'm willing to offer and trade my bishop for this central knight. So I try to do that. He can't really move away. I mean, if he moves somewhere like here, I think best would be maybe I just slide back or something like that. His knight's, actually no, in this scenario I would probably take here, he takes back, and then yes, I would get my queen where it wants to be, threatening almost mate ideas, and now I have space to get my rook over here without his annoying knight here. So he can't really move the knight, and same idea, I think if he comes over here, I could probably just slide back, maybe, where's the best spot? Where would be the best spot here? Because if I move away, he has some check ideas. Maybe I just slide all the way back, get my queen in front of the rook, so that way both of these pieces are kind of stuck defending the c2 square. But in any case, maybe he could have moved his knight, but he played queen moving up. And I think this is kind of a wasted move, because it allows me to take here, and if he takes the pawn back with queen, well, he really didn't do anything there. He moved his queen up 1 and then moved it up 2 more to take the piece back. So he allows me to take. I think that knight was really powerful there. Plus this knight was stuck because that knight was blocking him going to f4. So by taking, if he took with pawn, I was going to come, wait, yeah, so the reason the bishop is protecting the rook right now, if he takes with pawn, I have to defend this rook, so I would just come up here. Really, eventually this knight's going to come into the game, potentially have attacks on here, this rook's going to come over, essentially achieving my plan. So instead, the queen takes, my queen comes up to c7, and then I get my full formation. So these are very, very powerful. And now, not only that, both of his rooks are disconnected from the same files. So if this king ever gets stuck in the corner, there are back rank mate ideas, which is really cool. So he pushes the pawn, and my whole plan here really is to get him to make some sort of structural weakness if possible. The threat right now being if he does anything else, it is almost, well, it's checkmate or I win a rook. So if he takes back, queen would then take with checkmate. So he makes a structural weakness with this pawn on c3. So now that means my plan now, if I can achieve it, would be to be able to push the b pawn up to b5, then b4, and then take on c3. Once he takes back, I've got 3 attackers on this pawn, and he probably won't have enough to win it back. This knight is a little awkwardly placed. So the reason I don't start with b5 is because, well, I mean, he could just take the pawn right away. So I think it's a little too slow to start doing something like this, because he might do an ideal, well, maybe not that right away, but a little too slow, I think. You know, he can kind of start to prepare things, and then if I do it, well, his queen's almost stuck, actually, so I think that would just about win the queen if he does something else. No, because he'll take this pawn. So I instead, before trying to push my pawns, because before you get a good, before you get ahead, it's always good to move minor pieces and major pieces rather than pawns. Leave these guys the way they are. Because if you take a look, his pawns made a structural weakness. Now he's got a weakness on b3 as well as d3. So the weakness I saw right now was that this pawn was hanging, and if I can get check in with my queen, check, and then I could win this pawn and eventually win this pawn or even this one. So that's what I decided to go for instead, and then he backs his queen up to d2. Now I start with the a pawn push. The reason being this is what I want to do is get his piece out of the way, because I eventually can get up to a3 with an attack on b2. Now this was probably the biggest mistake of the game, I think. Better is probably to bring his knight over here, reposition it in some way, maybe back here, just to put more defense on the c3 pawn. Because I don't know if I can start pushing this right away. Maybe I can, but yeah, he wouldn't want to do this because that weakens this, of course. But if I ever, let's say he does come back here, if I ever come here, I think maybe now with enough defense on this pawn he can start to push. And then yes, this pawn is in here, but I can't really do anything about it. So by going king b1, he's actually kind of pinned himself, and that allows a4. So this pawn went all the way up to a4 in 2 moves, forcing his knight away. He's really only got 3 good squares that he can go to. Goes to d4, which again I think he could have done last move, and then I take the pawn. If he takes back, of course, not only do I get the queen for a rook, but it's actually not a full trade of 2 rooks because this is pinned now, thanks to my queen. So I do end up winning that pawn. He plays f4, now creating a weakness on the e4 pawn, which is nice because it comes with check. I bring my knight in to attack this pawn, so he has to defend it with queen going to e1. And then I bring my rook back, and I think better is probably maybe now a3, because if he, this would be really tough for him to make this move, I think, because look at how many pieces are going towards him, and maybe eventually I can kick his knight away and then do a sacrifice of my rook over here. Let's just see what that would look like if I did that. If he takes back, I mean, where's his knight going to go? There's nowhere really good, but let's just say he comes back here. Check. If he takes, check, and then mate in a move. So that's an idea that could be coming if he pushes that pawn. So maybe that's why a3 would be a little bit stronger. If he does bring the knight back here, I think this is probably more than enough compensation to go in here. Check is coming, followed by some other ideas. So instead, I bring my rook back, just attacking this knight twice, and then he brings his rook over. There may have been some ideas soon. So if we take a look real quick, like why didn't he take this pawn, this knight? So if he took this knight, I would take back his knight with able to take e4 with check. And if he ever takes this queen, it's actually checkmate in 1. So that knight's a little bit untouchable. That's why he didn't take it. Meanwhile, his queen also has to defend e4. So this rook having a double attack on the knight is pretty strong. He brings his rook over, and there's some other ideas. I can't really do this now because if he takes, yeah, there's no checkmate idea at this point. But the threat is there. So he goes here. I bring my queen in to try to force taking, if he does something weird. Take, rook takes, check. This looks a little deadly. Maybe I'd come in here at some point. If the queen took, this would be, actually that's not checkmate. So maybe I wouldn't do that just yet, but I think the idea could be coming. Really, I want to get out of the way of my b pawn so I can start getting both of these pawns up here like I did in the other game. Game 4, I think it was in the World Open, so that could be pretty strong. Instead, at this point, he plays a3. Another structural weakness here, but it is preventing my a3 pawn from coming in. So I do take a4 and this at this point. So let's see what happens. If he takes here, we do have checkmate soon. So I think it was check. If he takes, check, king to a2. I'm trying to recreate this from memory. Winning the rook, that's right. So that would be really strong. Not only that, but I have some mate ideas, and he has no compensation over here. So he can't really take that. And oh, by the way, a3 was really just giving himself some breathing space too, so his king wasn't going to be back rank mated. So instead, he actually just gives up the exchange. I take his rook, he takes back, and then I take to give myself a pass pawn. At this point, he plays f4 or f5, and I think he's just got a lot of pressure that really won't amount to anything. And maybe just being nervous, I wanted to simplify everything, so I do end up giving the exchange back, knowing that I've got this pass pawn to distract him, and I'll eventually get these 2 pawns when my rook comes up here. So he takes back, queen takes, rook takes. We now have a rook versus rook endgame with these 2 pawns overextended. So my first goal is to not give him these 2 pass pawns, although maybe I could have. Maybe at this situation, if he goes here, you know, I take this pawn, and if he pushes first, you know, this looks pretty good for me anyway. So yeah, maybe that would have been a better solution. These 2 pawns really can't get past a rook and a pawn. Meanwhile, my king is going to escort a couple different pawns up the board. So maybe that would have been just fine. Instead, I play b5, pushes f6, take back, take. So 2 pawns for my 1. While I do have 6 pawns against his 2, they are a little weird. 2 h pawns, 2 n pawns with a weakness of the b pawn. He does win this pawn right away. And you know, if I came forward, I didn't like the idea of him getting this pawn and eventually this one. It seemed like it wasn't really worth it, although maybe I still win at this point. Yeah, I mean, if he starts pushing, like, this is going to be a 1 game. So he can't quite push, and he can't easily get over here. So I think eventually I'll get this rook, and then I'll be able to push up. So maybe just the nerves, but that would have been just fine. So I come back, allow him to get one of the pawns, I guess, anyway. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. At this point, I think I was just getting a little bit more trouble, giving up too many pawns. But the main goal really here is just to get my king here, pawn here, queen, forces rook to exchange, then I'll have my rook and a pass pawn. So I just slowly work my way up there. At this point, if I can remember some of the other moves, I think it was something like this. Check, rook came over, I think he threatened this pawn, and I started pushing. It was something like this. So there's really not much he can do at this point. And if he ever takes, you know, this should be more than winning. He can never push this pawn. I can even just come in here and slowly bring my king over. So that was that game. Had some really good tactics over here on the king side. I think the key was getting my queen, rook, and other rook on the c file with a lot of pressure on his king. And then the main move, just bringing my a pawn up, really, once his king came over to b1, being able to win that pawn and eventually the game. So that was a fun one. This guy was a really good player, awesome, and analyzed the game with me afterwards, but ultimately won that game. The next game I played, I'll upload shortly. I was playing with the Yugoslav attack against the Dragon, so another similar variation. So I'll see you guys in that one.